that conservatives, Republicans, tend to say, come on, guys, we need more backbone.
Echo chambers don't really tend to be the big driver for toxic partisanship or this disdain for the other side.
The thing that kind of ruined our industry can also be the salvation of the industry because, like right now, you and I are doing a podcast.
Welcome to Our National Conversation, a podcast in which we discuss politics from all angles. We are completely nonpartisan, and all views, respectfully stated, are welcome here. Our podcast is unique in that it is hosted and run by students who are focused on finding solutions to the biggest problems facing America.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Our National Conversation. My name is Sam Taylor, and I'll be your host today. The current date is July 27th, 2025, and we're going to be doing something a little different for our discussion today. Normally, we talk about national issues on this podcast. We try to understand alternative perspectives on those issues. We really try to dig into the different narratives. And instead of just engaging in some, kind of mean-spirited or performative debate, we just really try to understand where one another is coming from. But today, I want to focus on something that's not national news. I want to focus on local issues and local change makers. These are people who are, just in their own communities, making positive change, doing things that have really stalled at the national level, but continuing to push our democracy forward, just on that kind of community level. And I want to talk a bit about the significance of this sort of activity and how this local change making can actually be a super positive force. Like I'm talking like really, really quite amazing, effect here on reducing polarization, on promoting societal well-being, promoting democratic health, and how a lot of our maladies in American politics today, things like that extensive polarization, are at least partially caused, based on current evidence, by a lack of engagement in local politics. So before we get into all of that, I'm joined today by Jeff Hall, who is the current Chief Executive Officer at Our National Conversation, the founder of ONC as well. And Jeff, you've been involved with journalism and news for a very long time. And I believe you've been involved with a lot of local journalism initiatives or kind of exploring that in your community in Brentwood that's in Los Angeles there. So if you'd like to take just a moment and describe kind of what your experience with local journalism, local problem solving has been, and then we'll continue the conversation from there.
Okay, thank you, Sam. Yes, my name is Jeff Hall. I'm a lifelong newspaper guy. I started my career at the Kansas City Star. I was there for 10 years. I started as a cub reporter. I switched departments several times. I was an advertising salesperson. I was a circulation department employee. That means delivering the paper. I was involved with promotion. I stayed there for 10 years and then worked at the White House for a year as something called a White House Fellow. While I was there, I was recruited to join the Los Angeles Times. I became president of the Valley and Ventura County editions, which I wouldn't call local news. I would call it more regional news. Los Angeles is huge, and so some of these regions comprise several communities within. And then later I went out on my own and started a little community newspaper called the Brentwood News. And I started this in 1991, a long time ago, and somehow it persists to this day. But as each year goes by, the print edition in particular seems weaker and weaker, and we are slowly but surely getting stronger and stronger on the digital side. But the nice thing about local news is that you know everybody. When I walk down the street in Brentwood, people know me, they recognize me, they talk to me, they'll often say, hey, you ought to do a story about this or a story about that, or I loved your last editorial, or I really didn't like your last editorial, whatever they want to say. And we're generally quite civil about it. We don't have the same kind of polarization that we see at the national level. People here don't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican or a Green or a MAGA or an independent or a libertarian, whatever you might be. The dividing line is typically over quality of life issues. And often that plays out in the field of development, maybe some developer wants to build a building on X and Y street corner, and it's going to be 10 stories tall according to the proposal. And right away, that draws out in opposition of people who are opposed to development for a lot of reasons. They don't like the added traffic impact. They worry about, whether there'll be enough parking in the area. They wonder if the type of uh, retail or office building or housing that's being proposed is actually going to benefit the community. And people go crazy over these issues. And sometimes it's even as small as whether there should be a stop sign on such a street corner.
Hmm.
These battles can drag out for weeks, months, even years, and people seem quite convinced in the righteousness of their positions that this new proposal is going to kill the community and bring about gridlock, or this new proposal is going to be one of the greatest things ever that will help advance the betterment of the community. So it's really quite interesting to see how energized people become about these issues, but they do. And I've always felt like the Brentwood News was kind of a mediating force here where we could help explain one side of the issue maybe to the other side and then explain the other side to the other side, and that we just keep the dialogue going. In an odd way, controversy is good for a news outlet because it gives you plenty to write about and talk about. And often people will take matters into their own hands and write a letter to the editor or just an email. And we publish these things locally so people, excuse me, can see what everybody else is saying. So many debates have occurred through the pages of the Brentwood News that actually have brought about, in my opinion, positive results for the community. And it's because we were here to serve as mediator, if you will.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. So what I want to do is maybe talk a little bit about why there seems to be this big national crisis in terms of reduction in local participation in politics, right? Because you mentioned there, like, there's lots of debates, at least in your community. There are people engaging with these proposals, but in terms of just looking at the U.S. as a whole and looking at the research and evidence that seems to exist, that seems to be like very much on the I suppose the decline, right? Or at the very least, just local engagement with, say, town halls or certainly media coverage of local issues, right? Is very much something that appears to be dying to a degree. There's various proposals on how to reinvigorate that. There's attempts to kind of, get back to that local coverage. But as a whole, it seems like there is a very big problem there. And just as you were describing that, I wonder if I don't know, like, when we talk about local issues and it does become things like whether we put a stop sign here or whether this building is this height or not and it's going to block out the sunlight, etc. I think what tends to happen is a lot of people, um, especially if they're not like, say they don't own property in the community or whatever else, they're much more involved on social media, etc. Um, I don't know. I feel like they're going to be drawn away from those issues and towards national issues, right? Just that just seem more interesting, exciting. They're kind of more overwhelming, and a lot of these local issues seem, relatively insignificant or petty or whatever else, and they're associated with maybe these HOAs complaining about these minor things. But I wonder if that perception itself is harmful, right? To kind of the local engagement in politics. Now, the reason I say that, I alluded to this at the beginning of the podcast, but it seems like the evidence seems pretty strongly to indicate that a lot of the cause of polarization in America and also political apathy, disengagement from institutions, etc., is the swallowing up of local issues and local controversies in these huge, all-consuming national ones. Right. So there was recently a paper that was published in 2022 by a guy named Peter Turnberg, and various other papers followed. This also seems to align with evidence from some other spheres. Um, but he's essentially arguing, and he's a political scientist, that it's not really echo chambers that produce polarization, right? We have this kind of thought that, oh, you become really polarized when you only interact with conservatives or Democrats. Um, his model here um, seems to be that really what's going on is sort of the media coverage, right, with the death of local journalism and so forth, and this all-consuming participation in national discourse frames everything in terms of Republicans and Democrats. And you kind of mentioned this earlier, Jeff. You know, when you're talking about local issues, your partisan identity doesn't really come up all that much. But when you're focused on the national level, everything falls into these binaries, right? Conservative, progressive, Democrat, Republican. Everything is sort of orchestrated into this same binary narrative, right? And there's political incentives as to why that happens, and maybe even just psychological incentives to try to process all the information. And this creates a sort of partisan sorting mechanism where people become more polarized, right? Because everything that they're receiving, everything they're using to interpret the world is filtered through this partisan binary. But that doesn't happen at the local level, or at least not nearly as much, right? And so when we have sort of a dearth of participation in local politics, as a general rule, we have increased polarization. Now, I'm not going to say that that's definitively proven. You know, obviously, Turnberg study is just one study. There's a few other studies. There's also some, a large literature that also argues that a reduction in local journalism increases polarization, and that seems to align with Turnberg's model here. But at the very least, it seems plausible. It seems the way that the evidence is tending at this time. So I just want to kind of get your thoughts on that, Jeff. Is this sort of what aligns with your perception of the way local issues work and versus national issues? That this is a really big driver of polarization.
Okay, you said a lot, so I'm going to try to respond to everything I can remember. First of
Yes,
all,
please do.
no,
Well, I apologize for that.
I actually don't agree that people care less and less about local issues. I
Mm,
think people maybe care more and more about local issues. What's really changed in local journalism is the arrival of the internet. There are just so many different ways now to get information. You know, we have the
mm,
old Brentwood News, which used to be called the Bible of Brentwood. They used to call me the mayor of Brentwood. Um, that's really no longer the case. Now we have, Facebook group pages devoted to Brentwood. We have a system called Nextdoor where people seem to go on all day long and complain about things. It seems like a rather whiny site to me. There are various newsletters that are put out by different people. Um, it just goes on and on. There are podcasts, YouTube videos, TikTok.
mm,
Uh, there's a lot of information coming at us now, and so I would actually say local coverage has gone way up, but it's also very fragmented. So you don't really know where to go to get the straight scoop
mm,
or to get the full picture. You have to go to a lot of different places. I find it actually very inefficient, but nevertheless, people have a voice now. I mean, anybody with an iPhone can, become an influencer these days.
mhm. And I wonder if just to maybe just talk about like whether local coverage is declining in some way or another. I wonder if maybe there's a bit of a generational gap here as well. Uh, I wonder if the demographics of people who engage with local politics, maybe tend to be older, have owned property in the community for a while, um, and maybe people who are on the younger side, who are renting or moving around, etc., just not as involved with that sort of coverage. And I also wonder, at the same time, if even if like the information about local politics is increasing, the information about national politics is increasing at even a much greater rate, and so still kind of swallowing it up. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I will say this. Even on these local platforms like Nextdoor or the Facebook pages, people do like to talk about national politics. And it usually creates something of a pushback. A lot of people say, hey, this is supposed to be about local issues. Please don't express your opinions about Donald Trump. We don't care. Um, so I'm not sure. Where you do see politics entering the conversation at the local level is on the issue of homelessness in particular here in Los Angeles, which is a
Mm,
huge deal. And I think it's safe to say that conservatives, Republicans, tend to say, come on, guys, we need more backbone. Let's clean up these encampments. Let's do whatever we got to do to get them off the streets. Um, and a lot of the liberal or so-called woke people might argue the opposite, saying, "Well, gee, these are our, poor brothers and sisters who need a little compassion. If they want to shoot up drugs, well, let's set up a place in town where they can do that safely and legally and that sort of thing." And that can become very polarizing. And we've seen, like in the last mayoral battle, there was a guy named Rick Caruso who used to be a Republican who then switched his party affiliation to Democrat because LA is a very Democratic city, and a lot of his advisors figured he just couldn't make it as a Republican. And he ran against a lady named Karen Bass, who's a lifelong Democrat. And homelessness was one of the issues that really got people energized. But what has happened since is in January, we had the Palisades fire not too far from here in Brentwood. We could see all of the smoke off in the distance. My wife and I actually had to leave our home for about a week. And many, many people think that Karen Bass and the Democrats really botched the situation and just it was just poor management. I mean, everything that could go wrong did go wrong, and people are still pointing fingers at one another. And a lot of people are now saying, well, maybe Rick Caruso should run again, and this time he will trounce Karen Bass. We'll see. But there you go, at kind of a local level, that becomes a national issue because even Donald Trump and others have now weighed in on this situation, saying, California is ineffective. We have poor fire management practices. It becomes part of the national narrative. Uh, and just recently, Donald Trump said he wanted the authority, I think this is what he said, to go in and take people off the streets who are clearly mentally incapacitated. Now, some people might think, well, that's a horrible conservative thing to say. I actually think it's a very practical thing to say because a lot of these people really cannot care for themselves and they are often menacing to everyday citizens who walk by the encampment. So uh, we'll see how it all shakes out, but this too can be very polarizing, even at a local level.
Hmm. Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think, even if everything's correct about what, Turnberg is writing and others kind of more local engagement tends to decrease polarization, more national engagement tends to increase polarization, even if that's generally true, right? It's not like greater local coverage is a fix-all for polarization. That polarization still enters, those national narratives still enter into these local issues, local conversations. And I think we need to be, fairly sober about that, just at least just based on what the evidence is saying so far. But I oh, sorry,
If
go
I
ahead.
could, if I could, I don't want to give people the impression from this conversation so far that people don't care about local news. I think they
Mm,
really do. Now, there is a generation gap, and I think there always has been. Back when we were just the Brentwood News and there wasn't all this digital activity, it was
mm,
obvious to me that it was mostly older people who really cared about our paper, what we wrote about, and young people, maybe once a year they'd pick up a copy. As you
mhm,
get older and become more part of the community and own a home or your kids are in school, then the local news becomes super important. That's always been the case. The problem facing local news right now isn't that people aren't interested, it's a business model problem.
mm,
With all of these different digital alternatives, they can produce news and disseminate it at very low cost compared to printing and delivering a traditional news.
mm,
And producing news is actually very labor intensive. You hire people, they go to meetings, they take notes, they write their stories. It takes time. You send out a photographer, it takes time. Um, and with people now with their iPhones, the traditional news sources have a harder and harder time competing economically. People can put up these digital things, and the advertisers have discovered that they can place an ad on Nextdoor for practically pennies compared to what they used to pay to the Brentwood News, and so it's much more cost effective from an advertiser's point of view. And one of the problems newspapers faced when the internet arrived was that it was really hard to measure the actual readership of a newspaper. If somebody, first of all, did they even pick up the newspaper? And then secondly, did they flip through to that page where your ad happened to appear, and then if they saw the ad, did they actually pay attention to it? And if they did see the ad and paid attention to it, did they actually follow through and buy something from your store? Now, that was very immeasurable, and it was always, something we had a hard time explaining to advertisers that even though it was hard to prove that the advertising was working, we believed it did, and we thought that they should advertise. But now with digital, they can know instantly whether their ad is working, whether it's generating clicks, and whether these clicks are clicking all the way through and buying something from somebody's digital storefront. So and they can do it incredibly inexpensively. So that's super hard for a traditional newspaper to compete with. And that's why there's so much attention being focused right now on the demise of local news because, how do you pay for it? That's the real issue. The news is there. We want the news. And if people don't get the news, that harms society. But how do you pay for the production and delivery of the news? That's the unanswered question at this point.
Mm. Thank you for that clarification and insight there, Jeff. Based on what you're saying, it's not that there's a death of interest in local news. There's just a death of being able to facilitate that local news in a way that isn't super fragmented, piecemeal, all over the place, and thus more easily swallowed up by everything that's occurring at the national and international level.
Yeah. Now, adding to this, Sam, is that there are these big companies, people who are driven by political agendas, who are actually buying up local news outlets or starting kind of fake news outlets that sound and look like they're local, but they're really just mouthpieces for people with a political agenda. Usually,
Mhm.
this is coming from the right. We see some of it from the left, but people do live in their echo chambers, and they often glom onto these sources where they can just get more hate and vitriol. I think it's a really sad development, but
Mhm.
I don't know how you put that genie back into the bottle.
Yeah. Well, that's actually an interesting point. I was reading that when we're talking about Americans as a whole and just, the majority of people, echo chambers don't really tend to be the big driver for, you know, this is sort of toxic partisanship or this disdain for the other side. But when we're talking about certain like fringe or sectarian groups, right, people who really engage in lots of hateful, kind of commentary, etc., maybe even people who engage in political violence, this is where echo chambers and kind of that insulated community full of these sort of repeated dogmas, that create a sort of extremist political creed there. That's where we see those echo chambers. So that certainly does exist, and that seems to play a role in polarization among certain groups, right? People who are much more, I suppose, extreme in their outlook and their activity. And so these kind of fake news outlets may very well play a role in that. I'm not sure. Mhm.
The alarm bell has been sounded. There are some big national foundations who have pledged to raise and spend a lot of money trying to figure out what local business models work. There's an effort
Mhm.
called pressforward.news. Anybody can go there, and I think they're pledging to raise and spend $500 million on experiments all around the country to see what might work and what might maybe doesn't work to try to figure out a good direction forward for local publishers. So it's actually a very fertile time. There are a lot of people trying lots and lots of things. We have Substack newsletters, we have podcasts, we have
Mhm.
uh, various print attempts. We have TikTok type channels. You name it, it's out there. And some of them do very well, and a lot of it gets back to
That's good.
content and the voice of the person behind it. Does the person have a following? Is the person trusted? Can they amass an audience? Because you need to amass a pretty big audience before it makes sense for advertisers to support you.
Mhm.
And I don't know how a local publication works without advertising support. I know there are a lot of subscription models that people are trying. You pay X number of dollars a month or per year to receive the newsletter. Um, but people have been very well trained by the internet to want to get their news for free. And so
Mm.
It's hard to charge for a subscription and make it work, but you know, hope springs eternal. I think we all just need to keep trying our best until something shakes out and it
Mhm.
all starts working again.
Yes, let's talk a little bit about maybe those solutions, right? As opposed to just discussing the problem. Um, you mentioned there's a few of these approaches that do seem to be doing well, or at least a few executions of them. They're doing well. A few of these local outlets, etc. Models. Is there anything just off the top of your head that you can point to? It's like, here's a tangible example of local news, a local news initiative actually working. It's fine if you don't have anything off the top of your head. I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, but just anything there in terms of like tangible solutions, people who are on the ground doing something good there.
I don't know the name of the outlet, but I know there's one in Atlanta that has a big following. And um, there are a bunch actually. I get these newsletters all the time from people who cover the local news scene, and they're always championing new ideas and experiments. I'd have a hard time rattling off specific ones, but
Sure.
they're out there for sure.
Hmm. And are these just people, to your knowledge, that they're just really charismatic, and so they're able to create kind of this online following, and they focus on those local issues. They attract people who are there in the community. Is there something they're doing about the business model that seems to be really effective, or are you not sure on those details?
Well, a lot of the people who are now getting into local journalism uh, are people who are former journalists who worked for the big traditional news outlets. And then as the news outlets have trimmed back and laid people off, a lot of these people didn't know what to do next. And so now they're jumping into the local news arena. The thing that makes it possible is digital technology. So the thing that kind of ruined our industry can also be the salvation of the industry because like right now you and I are doing a podcast.
Mhm.
It doesn't really cost us anything to do this except for our time. You're not getting paid to do this podcast. I'm not getting paid to appear on it. So our costs are essentially zero. Or I think we spend what, $39 a month on various digital tools that help us with podcasting and that sort of thing. So that's a very low barrier to entry. There's really nothing stopping anybody from starting a local news outlet if they want. And and so almost every single community I know of has now two or four different voices competing for attention. Uh, but it's not a crushing blow to anybody if they don't make it. If they don't survive and they quietly shut down 6 months or a year from now, they probably didn't spend that much money in the process of getting up and running in the first place. Unlike, say, the Brentwood News, which I poured a fortune into that thing over the years, and it was very painful for me personally. But hope springs eternal. I'm cooking up some ideas right now that I think could be good for the Brentwood community because I think we have lost something over time. It's just the community isn't quite as connected as it used to be, and I think people miss it.
Hmm. No, that's good. That's encouraging. I mean, I think oftentimes when we're talking about these issues, there's just this it encourages this overwhelming sense of apathy, right? Like we can't really do anything to create change. This is a huge problem. Tons of people have thrown money and ideas at it, and we've gotten nowhere. But that doesn't quite seem to be the case with this particular issue, right? And I think that you mentioned those super low costs to entry, at least in just a digital environment. At least when we don't factor in like costs of time, etc. But I think that it just really needs to be stressed. How much someone can change and make a positive difference just in their community, right? We're not talking about a single individual solving the various crises in the Middle East, or addressing the deficit, or creating greater affordability in America, or bringing manufacturing back, or whatever else. These issues that seem so large and so overwhelming. That there's not really anything that one person can do other than maybe change an icon on a social media profile or repost something. Um, But with these local issues, right, with these community issues, whether that's local journalism or trying to solve like policy issues on the local level in various ways, I mean, the individual can have a pretty sizable impact, right? And I think that maybe we just kind of need more of that mentality, among people who feel like there's nothing they can do about politics and public policy. It's all too big. Just refocus on kind of what's around you. Who are the people that live near you? What's your city or neighborhood doing? And how can you make some positive change? Because when you aggregate that, I wonder, if that has, maybe a greater positive effect on pushing democracy forward and promoting democratic health than a lot of these national issues we constantly debate.
There's no doubt in my mind, and I'm not saying this to pat myself on the back, but over the years, I've written many editorials in the Brentwood News where I took a position and advocated for an outcome, usually in these NIMBY versus developer battles. And I'll give you an example in a moment. And left to the people themselves, these issues become so polarizing that they end up in stalemate, and people get angry. They really do. And before you know it, half the time they're talking to the other half. And then, like King Solomon, I come in and grab my sword and say, let's split the baby, and here's a solution that I think could work. And at first, it kind of angers both sides because it's like I'm calling for an end to the battle, and they want to keep fighting. But then, if they're thinking about it, they come to realize, well, maybe what Jeff is saying here makes sense. So I'll give you an example to put some meat on the bones, if you will. So years ago, there was this huge fight about a project here in Brentwood called the Munger Project. There was a guy named Charlie Munger, who's now dead, who is a billionaire, was a billionaire, and he bought up several properties on San Vicente Boulevard, which is the main drag in Brentwood, and consolidated them into about a 3-acre property, and he proposed building this big retail outlet there. Right away, the opponents came out of the woodwork and said, no, 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 this will add way too much traffic, and this will cause parking problems in the area, and we don't really need more stores in Brentwood. There are plenty of stores here. And proponents said, well, gee, this could be good for the local economy. We could create jobs. Maybe we could create some affordable housing for public servants like police officers and teachers and nurses who typically drive in from far away because they can't afford to live in Brentwood, which is a very upscale community. So there was a fertile debate as to what would be the ideal outcome for this particular property. Now, Charlie Munger took the position basically, well, it's my property. I can do with it what I want. And he wanted to knock down this old building that some people loved. And it actually has historic preservation of some sort. And finally, Charlie just threw up his hands. He was so frustrated that he said, I don't care what happens to this property. I'm old. I'm going to leave it in the hands of my children. I'll be gone soon. You guys can figure it out later. Now, that was like 20 years ago. So this property now has been boarded up this entire time on this wonderful stretch of San Vicente Boulevard. It's a real eyesore, and nothing's happening with it. So when the battle was coming to a conclusion, I was a little late with this idea, but I came up with this idea. I said, I got this idea for what we could do with the property. Why don't we turn it into a retirement/assisted living village, and all the old people in Brentwood, and we have plenty of them, rather than having to move to Palm Springs or Santa Monica or Northern California or wherever they go when they retire, they could continue to live right here in the community. We don't have a retirement village here in Brentwood. And boom, everybody said, hallelujah, that's the idea. And the reason they liked the idea was because it really wouldn't generate traffic. Most really old people, once they check themselves into a retirement village or assisted living, they're not driving much. They might attract a few visitors now and then, but it's not going to cause traffic jams. And we do have huge traffic jams in LA, so this is a valid concern. We wouldn't need all the parking again for all the same reasons. Once people check in, they're going to stay there. And then we could have some light retail things that would attract members of the community. It could be a friendly gathering place. The design I came up with had like a big courtyard in the middle where people could gather. And everybody loved the idea. So I got in touch with Charlie Munger, who was still alive at the time. And I said, I should have come up with this idea earlier, but maybe it's not too late for you to reconsider pulling out of this project and let's go forward with this because the community actually really likes this idea. He was so burnt out, he basically said, forget it. But people to this day, when they see me on the streets, they'll stop me and say, "Hey, what's ever going to happen with that retirement village? My mom's getting old. We don't want to ship her off to the desert. We'd rather keep her here in Brentwood." So I think it's an idea that still could happen, and it's certainly something that people still talk about. So politics just takes a long time. Working through the issues takes a long time. But I don't think this chapter is over yet.
Hmm. Well, yeah, and that's kind of exactly what I was alluding to earlier. It's um, Jeff, you're just kind of one person there, but you offered this idea, and it seems to have created, a pretty big positive change in the community. Now, the retirement village hasn't been implemented yet, but as you said, there's kind of a broader consensus among the residents of Brentwood. Hey, this seems to be something that we can all get behind, and now it's just a matter of kind of finalizing the idea, actually implementing it. Maybe this guy's children are more, um, I suppose, you know, amiable to the idea. Um, and that's exactly the sort of thing. It's like if we're talking about some massive national issue, really all that I can do as an individual, unless I gain public office or become, like a really influential lobbyist or activist or something like that, right? Which is pretty much out of the realm of possibility for the majority of people. Um, all I can do is just post something on social media or join a protest or something like that. And generally, the efficacy of those things maybe isn't like super great. Um, and so I wonder if that creates this just continued sense of apathy. Like what's the point? Why should I devote my time to something that's not going to have any effect, right? But when we're talking about these local issues, when we're talking about improving the community, individuals can absolutely have that major effect. And the aggregate of that across the US, I mean, I think that's how we really promote democratic health. We need a culture of that civic participation, of that community participation. And certainly people are interested in that, but we don't have maybe the media environment that really helps facilitate that and push it forward. Um, as you said, it's all fragmented and kind of piecemeal. So I don't know. Those are just kind of my ill-formulated thoughts on this issue as you're describing it and based on what I've read. But I really think that this, I don't know, it just seems to me to be a really major route towards improving democratic health.
Yeah. You caused me to think of something just now. The LA Times used to be huge in Los Angeles. Back in my day when I worked there, we had like 1.1 million circulation daily and 1.4 million on Sunday. These were hard copy newspapers. And I think now they're down to like 200,000 maybe or something like that. There's been a massive fall off in the print delivery. Now they do have a digital presence, but the paper isn't nearly as influential as it used to be. It used to be the really civic leader, the driver of where the city was going to go. And we have a billionaire who bought the paper a couple years back, Dr. Philip Sunshang. And on the one hand, he's kept the paper alive, and rumor has it he's losing like $50 million a year, which seems crazy. But for a while there, he essentially turned over the opinion page of his newspaper to his young daughter, who was very, very liberal. It was very alienating to moderate and conservative people. Circulation dropped even more. And now Dr. Philip Sunshang has just announced he wants to take the LA Times public and allow people to buy a piece of the action and make it a truly voice of the people kind of community newspaper. So it remains to be seen whether that will be successful or not. But this gives you an example of one person making a difference, and maybe the paper got off course for a while. Now it's trying to course correct. But there's a lot of energy and activity that goes into media outlets. I mean, oh, too many billionaires, frankly, are getting into the game. You got Elon Musk, who's taken over Twitter, which is now X. You got Donald Trump, who has his own Truth Social. Social. Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. It's almost like a football or basketball franchise now. It's a game for
Hmm.
rich people to play, and a lot of people with less money question whether this is really a good thing or a bad thing, and that if you put too much power into the hands of these billionaires who often have political agendas, then we're kind of all living at their mercy, aren't we? How do you get back to a truly community spirit where everybody has an equal voice? Maybe Dr. Soon Shang is onto something here. We'll
Hmm.
see.
Yeah.
I can say at the Brentwood News, we announced very early on when we started that we were going to remain completely nonpartisan and we were not going to endorse candidates, even at the local level. And I think because of that, people trusted us from the beginning, and I think they still do. And Sam, as you know, we've now started this thing called our national conversation, and a lot of the values that have gone into that stem from my personal experience at Brentwood News. At ONC, we don't endorse candidates. We allow everybody to have an opinion. We don't care if it's liberal, moderate, or conservative, but we're just a platform where everybody is equally welcome, so long as they maintain their civility and don't start attacking each other in an ugly way or with fake news or anything like that. So I think people are tired of all the partisanship, both at the national level, the regional level, and maybe even the local level. It's just not practical. I think if we can focus people on solving problems, then it's going to cause people to come together in a new way and say, okay, we might not like each other politically, but we have a problem here, and how are we going to solve it?
Hmm. Yeah. No. I mean, I think that's exactly it. And maybe I go back to the political science literature a little too much, but just that focus on tangible problem solving. Just hey, we have a problem. We have to come up with a solution. Let's just sit down and take care of it. It's something that's local, that just affects our everyday lives. That's again one of the best ways to increase that collaboration, that desire to work with people on the other side, to diminish polarization. It's just we're on the same team. We have a problem. Let's take care of it. And when you're just on that huge national level, that really that doesn't end up happening. What happens is let's each run through our canned talking points and try to make the other look bad. It's a very different environment.
It's so stupid. It really is. I read a lot of news all day long, and I watch the cable TV talk shows at night, and it's all about scoring points at the other side's expense and making
Hmm.
them look dumb. But I've got friends on the left and the right, and my conservative friends think I'm too liberal. My liberal friends think I'm too conservative, but they're often trying to make a point, like convince me that they are right
Hmm.
and I'm wrong or my friends are wrong. And I think it tends to cause walls of defense to go up, and we
Oh
want
yeah.
to sort of dig in our heels and say, no, 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 I'm right, and you're the one who's wrong. And then before you know it, everybody's blood pressure rises and we're all mad at each other. But what does that accomplish really? And I sometimes think we're all just little pawns in this gigantic scheme, and the people at the top are like puppet masters, and they're manipulating all of us, and if they can keep us all off balance and angry at each other, then we're not really looking at what they're doing behind the scenes to enrich themselves or strengthen their power base and that sort of thing. I don't know, that's a dark view of the world, but it sometimes feels that way to me.
Hmm. Well, I certainly think it's a increasingly common view, in American politics today. But yeah, um, it's not a perfect fix all, and certainly there could be that blood pressure and negative feelings on the local level. But I just think based on what I'm reading and based on what you said, Jeff, that local problem solving is generally just a much better environment for collaboration than these national issues. And none of this is to say we should stop focusing on national issues or we shouldn't pay attention to what's going on, on the international scale or whatever else. But I just think it seems to be so lopsided, at least for me and in my circles. It's very rare am I talking with my friends about what's going on in the suburbs here in Salt Lake County. It's much more focused on those national politics if we're talking about politics. So I don't know. I just think that's a something that needs to be have greater visibility is these local issues because as we've said, people are interested in this, or at least you are if you're maybe part of the demographic who's been invested in the community for a while. So maybe me and my friends will be at that point relatively soon. Um, but it doesn't have that media attention that it needs.
Yeah. I'll give you one last example, and I think we should sign off soon, Sam. We don't want to bore these people into submission here.
Yep.
Okay, so I just wrote this in the Brentwood News. We have a big problem with cracked sidewalks here in LA. Anywhere you go, trees have been growing for years and their roots creep along below the sidewalks. They crack the sidewalks pop up. And before you know it, you've got these huge gaps, sometimes, several inches. And people trip and fall and they crack their heads open or break their backs or whatever. It's not good. And what do? They sue the city and say, you haven't maintained the sidewalks. I fell, hurt myself, broke my hip. Now I'm going to sue you for a lot of money. And the city ends up paying off these people. They settle the lawsuits because they've done some sort of a calculation, I've heard, saying we could spend less money per year just settling these lawsuits than it would cost to actually fix the sidewalks. Now, that seems really crazy to a lot of us. It's like we have a fundamental problem with highly identifiable root causes. If we just fix the sidewalks, then the problem would go away. But the city just can't afford to do it, and so they keep punting this thing into the future. And meanwhile, the city is going broke it's going bankrupt, and we have a lot of problems in LA. So people like me who operate at the local level often argue, forget Congress in Washington. They're never going to solve anything. It's broken by partisan gridlock. And even in LA, the city is so bureaucratic and there's so much red tape and inefficiency. It's hard to see how the city is going to come to the rescue anytime soon. So I actually wrote recently that maybe what we ought to do is all have a party one weekend and all get out there in front of our own homes with a sack full of concrete or blacktop and let's just fix our own sidewalks in front of our own homes. And that way, we can make the problem go away. It might cost us $50 each for a bag full of concrete, and maybe we'll have to, shovel some stuff for a couple hours. But I think it's going to come to that. The city just isn't solving these problems, and I think more and more at the local level we need to rise up. There was an article the other day I saw where in some part of the west side here in LA, people have been asking for a crosswalk for the longest time. They couldn't get it, so people literally got out there the other night with paintbrushes and they painted their own crosswalk on a public street. I think that's what it's going to take.
Hmm. Yeah. Yep. Well, I think that's probably a good note to end off on, Jeff. So if anyone is still watching this after Jeff and I's kind of meandering conversation, which I thought was at least valuable for you and I, Jeff, but I think the takeaway is just look around and see what you can actually do to improve your community. And, really at the end of the day, I think that's one of the best things that in aggregate is going to, foster the health of our democracy. So for whatever that's worth, that's the suggestion. That's the takeaway.
I'll say one more thing. In my many years of witnessing firsthand through the Brentwood News how the little community works, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind it's usually a handful of motivated citizens who stand up and say, hey, we need a new park, or we're going to clean up this street corner, or we're going to fix this local school or whatever. When they throw their arms around a project and get involved and raise money for it, it happens. If you wait for the city to make it happen or the national government, forget it. You're going to be waiting a very long time.
Hmm. Yep, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you for anyone who's watching. If you like this conversation, feel free to like, subscribe. If you have suggestions for how we can improve the podcast in the future, please leave those. If you have thoughts on the conversation or maybe community initiatives that you've been engaged in, please leave comments about those as well. Otherwise, thanks again, Jeff, and we'll return to this next week.
Very good. See you, Sam.
This podcast was brought to you by Our National Conversation, a place where students generate policy solutions to the biggest problems facing America. Join us in freeing political dialogue from hyperpartisanship. To learn more about what you heard today, check us out at ournationalconversation.org. You can also follow us on social media at Our National Conversation to show your support and keep up with our latest efforts.